Welcome back to the Obby series. In today's episode, we're going to be implementing the Rebirth system. The way that the Rebirth system is going to work is once a player in our Obby has reached the last stage, the Rebirth GUI will be displayed to them, and then they can click on the Rebirth button, which will reset them back to the first stage in our Obby, and then increase the total amount of rebirths that they have. We'll also add a UI button to our left GUI, which players can click on to open and close the Rebirth GUI as well. So, with all that being said, let's hop directly into Studio. Now, the first thing that we're going to do inside of Studio is add the open button to the left GUI. So, inside of our starter GUI, we have the left screen GUI. Let's go inside of that, go inside of the frame, and now we have two text buttons inside of here already. Let's go ahead and duplicate the settings button. I'll go ahead and rename the topmost one to be called Rebirth. And remember, we've already discussed how we can actually change the placement of the button by using the layout order. So if we want this to appear a little bit lower, we can set this to 1, for example, or we could set this to -1 if we want this to appear all the way towards the top. Of course, depending on your scenario, you might have to modify the layout order of the other buttons as well, but that's how we can do it. So for the Rebirth button, I'm going to go ahead and set this to -1 just to make it appear all the way towards the top. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and actually update the image of the icon image label. And I'm going to go ahead and use my Rebirth icon right here. Remember, if you don't have your own icons, you can actually get my icon pack for completely free by visiting MonzterDev. There's also a link directly to the pack down below in the description as well if you want to use it from there. Since we've updated the icon, we also have to update the text of the title text label, and rather than saying settings, let's go ahead and actually say Rebirth. And now that we've done that, we're fully finished with creating this button, so we can collapse all of those. And now the next thing that we're going to do is actually create the Rebirth GUI, which is actually very, very easy. So to create the GUI, what we're going to do is we're actually going to duplicate the skips GUI, and then we'll go ahead and rename one of these to be called Rebirth. We also want to make sure that we set the enabled property to true so that we can actually see it. And then let's go inside of the GUI and inside of the frame. Now, our Rebirth GUI is going to be set up exactly the same as our skips GUI, just because, in my opinion, it makes so much sense to do it this way, and I think it looks perfectly fine to suit both of these. But of course, if you want to make your own adjustments, then I would recommend doing it towards the end of this episode once you've gotten everything figured out and actually set up. So inside of the Rebirth GUI, what we're going to do is we're first going to go ahead and update the title text label. So let's go ahead and set the text of this to say Rebirth. And now let's go ahead and update the text of the description. And the text that we're going to insert here is actually going to explain how a player can rebirth. So I'm going to set this text to say complete every stage of the obby to rebirth. Of course, if you want to set to anything different, you're more than welcome to do that. Then I want to go ahead and update the title text label that's stored inside of the use button. So rather than this displaying the word use and then 999, we actually want this to say Rebirth. Now, it's perfectly fine if you would rather this just say use or anything else like that. The text here doesn't really matter, it's just all visual, but feel free to set this to whatever you want to as well. And you might feel obliged to rename the text button from use to Rebirth, but in my opinion, I think it makes a lot more sense to keep our GUIs kind of set up the exact same way so that when it comes to scripting, we can use pretty much the exact same logic and not confuse ourselves at all. I think that when we kind of do the same thing multiple times, but kind of do it a little bit differently, and when I'm referring to doing it kind of differently, I'm referring to kind of just doing the small changes to this GUI, not actually renaming the use button here. But I feel like when we're kind of doing these same things that we've already done in the past, it really helps cement that knowledge into our head and can kind of begin to connect different dots together that you might not have realized or you might have been confused about before. But ultimately, I think it's really good at kind of reinforcing and cementing this knowledge that we've already done in the past, and now we're doing it once again, and now we kind of understand where we're going rather than we figure it all out at the end after we fully created it. Anyway, pointless rant right there, but with that being said, the last thing that I actually want to do in this GUI is modify the progress bar a little bit. So we're going to go inside the progress bar, and all I actually want to do is update the amount text label. For our skips, we display time over top of our progress bar, but when it comes to rebirthing, we actually want to display the amount of stages that the player has reached versus the total amount of stages. So I'm going to say 0/50, and that would represent the player being on stage 0 and then there being 50 total stages. Again, this text doesn't really exactly matter because once we get around to scripting this, we're automatically going to update this text. So whatever text we set here is not actually going to matter in the first place, but just to clear up any possible confusion, that's why I like to update it just like that. And now with that being said, we're actually fully finished with creating this GUI. So what we can do is we can go ahead and set the enable property of it to false. And now we no longer see it. Now that we've created all the GUIs that we need to create, let's go ahead and begin scripting this. In order to begin scripting this, like I do for most of the new systems which are going to require some type of player data changes, let's go ahead and first update the actual player data. So to do this, we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, and then we'll open up the player data module script. Inside of here, we want to first go to our player data variable all the way towards the top, and now below the desk key value pair, I'm going to go ahead and add in rebirth, and we're going to specify the type of that to be a number. Then we want to go down to our default player data variable, and again, below defs, we're going to go ahead and insert rebirth, and we're going to set that to 0 because we want the players to start off with 0 rebirths. Now, another kind of side rant, I'm not sure if you guys want to have rebirth as being plural or singular. I went with singular in this instance just because it felt like it made more sense to me, but I can completely understand if you would rather go with rebirths with an S rather than just rebirth. If you are going to go with an S though, what I would recommend is that you either use that S in every single location that you ever see me use the word rebirth, or you change that all the way at the end. I think that if you're following a tutorial and then you kind of branch out and do your own thing while you're following along with it, that process is a lot more prone to errors and unfixable issues. Whereas if you were to follow it all the way through and then make your changes towards the end, then you'd be able to find your issues much easier and rule out different things that are not actually causing that issue, for example. But anyways, with that being said, we fully finished with updating the player's data, so let's go ahead and exit out of this. Now that we've updated the player's data, let's also consider another thing that we would have to update, which is very intertwined with the player's data, and that would be the state manager. So what we're going to do is we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the functions folder, and we're going to open up the update state module script. And now the first thing we want to do inside of here is add the brand new action for when a player rebirths. So below where you skip action, let's go ahead and create another table. We'll set the type of this to be called rebirth. And our rebirth action will actually have an additional argument, which is going to be called amount, and that would be a number. Now, we actually want amount to be optional, so let's go ahead and add a question mark to the end of that. And now one of the reasons that we're adding the amount argument here is because there might be different times where maybe we want to give the player multiple rebirths. Maybe we just want to test our game out and just see what would happen when we give ourselves multiple rebirths. So I think it's just kind of nice to add that extra option here because it really doesn't require much more work from us, and it makes our system a lot more dynamic and allows us to do different things with it in the future that we might not have been able to without this argument, for example. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and fix the formatting of this just like that. And now let's go ahead and actually update the function down here. Now, although I didn't add the action to the update state action type below defs, for example, I'm going to go ahead and actually add the if statement below update defs in the function. So I'm going to say else if action.type equals rebirth. And now if it does equal rebirth, there's a couple of different ways for us to handle this, again, because amount can be optional. We could kind of do what we did inside of earn skip, where we also made the amount optional, and right here we said if amount, then action.amount equals that, so what it already is, or we set it to 1 by default. You could do it that exact same way, but I'm going to show you another way that you could do this. And it's just a little bit simpler. I mean, both methods work, and I think that actually using this method would be more recommended by developers, but this solution is also perfectly fine to use as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and say player data, and now we want to update the rebirth key. And what do we want to set the value to? Well, we're actually going to say plus equals. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add action.amount, and then we'll say or 1. So what this will do is if action.amount actually exists, like if we were actually given a specific amount, then player data.rebirth will be increased by that amount. Otherwise, if an amount is not given, then it'll use the number 1 right here. It is literally the same thing as saying if action.amount, then use action.amount, else use 1. I mean, that works perfectly fine there as well. It's just a little bit more to type out. So this is kind of like the shortened version of it. Like I said, it's more recommended to use the if then statement rather than using the keyword or here. But for this solution, it's perfectly fine to use or, and it's just an alternative solution than using this. And now with all that being said, we're fully finished with updating the state, so we can go ahead and close out of this module script as well. Now, we're very close to begin scripting this on both the server and the client side, but before we do that, what I want to do is actually add in the networking, so I want to go ahead and create the remote event that we're going to use during this episode. So inside of the replicated storage, we'll go inside of the remotes folder, and then we want to go ahead and add in a brand new remote event, which I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate one of our old remote events, and then we'll rename it. Now, what do I want to rename this to? Well, I just want to go ahead and rename this remote event to be called Rebirth. And now that we've done that, we can collapse the remotes folder and the replicated storage as well because we're done inside of there. Now, I think normally I actually begin scripting all of these systems or most of these systems on the server side, but today we're going to begin scripting this on the client side. And like I said, the different things that we're going to be doing in today's episode is going to be pretty similar to the skip system that we created. So I feel like if you've watched the skip system and we started on the server side first and maybe you were confused by that or you didn't recognize all the different things that we were going to do, I think that now when we're starting it from the client side, you should have a much better overview or understanding and planning of what we're going to do on the client side and how that's going to reflect on the server side or the different things that we'll then do on the server side. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and begin scripting this on the client side. We're going to go inside of the start player, inside of the start player scripts, inside of the controllers folder, and the first thing that we want to do is actually update the GUI controller and add the GUI to it. So we'll go inside of here, and then we'll go down to the GUI's variable, and below skips, let's go ahead and duplicate that line. We'll go ahead and say rebirth, and the GUI that we want to wait for is actually called rebirth, just like that. And with that being said, we fully finished with updating the GUI controller, so we can go ahead and close out of that. And now the next thing that we're going to do is go inside of the GUI folder, and we're going to go inside of the top folder. We're going to duplicate the skips module script inside of here and put that inside of the GUI's folder. We'll then go ahead and rename this to be called rebirth, and now we'll go ahead and modify this module script and use this for scripting the entire Rebirth system on the client side. So now inside of here, we are going to need a lot of the exact same variables, but we might need to make some changes to them. So before we update this UI controller variable, what we're going to do is create another variable for the stages config. So we're going to say stages config, which is going to be equal to require replicated storage.configs.stages, just like that. Now let's go ahead and update the GUI controller variable, because originally this script was inside of the top folder. We have to remove one of the parents from here. And now to know that we're right, we should be able to say parent dot, and then actually see things like the state controller, GUIs, which is the folder inside of the controller's folder, and different things like that suggested to us. So we should see the GUI controller right here as well, and that's how we know that we're in the right directory. Then let's go ahead and update the state controller variable as well by removing one of the parents, and now we're good to go for both of those. We also have the remotes variable here, which is good to go. Then we have the GUI variable, which we actually want to change from using the skips GUI to use the rebirth GUI. We then have a variable for the frame, the progress bar, the use button, and the open button, which we're going to keep all of those, but we want to make one change to the open button. Now we actually have to update this all the way from the GUI's variable. So rather than going inside of the top GUI, we want to go inside of the left GUI, inside of that frame, and then we want to get the rebirth button just like that. Then we can go ahead and actually remove the two constants right here because we're not going to be using them. Now inside of the onStart function, we are going to want to keep the setup GUI function call right here, but we can remove a lot of these other things. So I'm going to go ahead and actually remove all three of these lines right here. I'm going to keep the event listener for when we actually click on the use button, but we're not going to do exactly what we do inside of here. So I'm just going to delete that code, but kind of leave this shell right here. Then we're not actually going to listen or care about the property change signal, so we can delete that. And now the logic that's inside of here is going to be pretty similar to what we're actually going to write, but I'm still just going to remove all of that, but still leaving where we listen to the update state event. Then going down to the functions, we actually are going to keep the update progress function, but we're going to remove everything inside of there. And then for the update use button function, we're actually going to remove that entirely as well. So this is pretty much all that you should actually be left with. So now the first thing that we're going to do is go ahead and set up the update progress function. In order to update the progress bar of how close the player is to rebirthing, what we need to do is get the stage that the player is currently at. So we're going to create a variable called stage, and then we'll use the state controller, we'll use the getState function, and then we're going to get the stage just like that. Now that we know what stage the player is on, we then need to determine what the max stage is. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called total stages, which is going to be equal to the stages config, and then we can use the getTotalStages function. Now that we've gotten both of those numbers, we can actually begin calculating the progress that the player has made. So we're going to create a variable called progress. And now to calculate the progress of the player, we would divide the stage that the player is on by the total amount of stages that there are. This would actually give us their progress as a percentage. And now that we've calculated that, let's go ahead and create a variable for a progress text. And how we want to display our progress is first we want to include the stage that the player is on, then we'll use a slash, and then on the right side of the slash, we want to display the total amount of stages that there are in our game. And now that we've created all those variables, let's go ahead and actually update the progress bar. So we're going to say GUI controller.handle progress bar. Then we want to go ahead and pass through the actual progress bar, which is a canvas group. Then we need to pass through the progress amount, which would be the progress variable. And finally, we want to pass through the progress text that should be displayed over top of the progress bar. And with all that being said, we're finished with creating this function. So let's go ahead and use it. And now the first place that we're going to use it is actually inside of the onStart function. So after we set up the GUI, let's go ahead and update the amount of progress that the player has made. And now when else are we going to want to update the amount of progress that the player has made? Well, we actually want to go inside of the update state function. And anytime the state is updated, what we would want to do is check if the action is update stage. Because if the player's stage has changed, that means that they've made more progress towards rebirthing, so we should update the progress bar. So we're going to create a variable called isStage. And what we're going to do is we're going to check if the type of the action is update stage. And now if that actually is the action, then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and call the update progress function. Now, in addition to updating the player's progress whenever their stage changes, we might also want to update their progress when they rebirth as well. Now, ultimately, that probably will be handled by isStage, but writing one extra line of code really never hurt anybody, so we might as well just include it here. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another variable, which is going to be called isRebirth. And what we're going to do is we're going to check if the type of the action is actually rebirth. So now if the action is stage, or if the action is rebirth, then we're going to go ahead and update the progress. Now, there's one more thing that we want to do when the update state event actually occurs. And to do that, we actually need to use the second parameter, which is passed through this event right here. And the second parameter would be the new state of the player. So what their state looks like after the changes have been made to their player data. And of course, that would be of the state controller.player data type. So now that we have access to the new state, the next thing that we want to do is we want to actually display this GUI once the player reaches the final stage, because that's when they're able to rebirth. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to check if the action is the update stage action. And now if the action is update stage, then what we're going to do is we're going to track the player's new stage. And we can get this by saying new state.stage. So now we know the current stage that the player is actually on. And then we're going to create a variable called canRebirth. And what we're going to do is we're going to check if the new stage that the player is on is greater than or equal to the max stage. So we would say stageconfig.getTotalStages. And now if the player actually can rebirth, so we're going to say if can rebirth then what we're going to do is we're going to use the GUI controller and we're going to use the toggle GUI function and we're going to make the GUI visible to the player. So that's how we'll actually handle making the GUI visible to the player once they've reached our last stage and are actually able to rebirth. Now, there's one more thing that we have to do inside of this module script, and that's going to be creating a new function. And this function is going to be a part of the local table, and we're going to use this function for actually allowing the player to rebirth. So we're going to go ahead and call this rebirth, and it's not going to have a single parameter. Now, this function is going to be triggered whenever the player clicks on the use button. So whenever the player tries to rebirth, the first thing we want to do is check if they're even able to rebirth. And we can pretty much take most of the logic that we use up here inside of the update progress function. So we're going to need to get the stage that the player is currently on, and we're going to need to figure out the total amount of stages in our game. And then I'll go ahead and create a variable called canRebirth. And now, of course, if the stage that the player is currently on is greater than or equal to the total stages, then we know that they can rebirth. So we would say if can rebirth then, and then what we're going to do if the player can rebirth is we'll go ahead and fire off the rebirth remote event to the server just like that. And now that we've created this function, let's go ahead and actually use it. And like I said, we're going to use this function whenever the player uses the use button or clicks the use button. Now inside of here, we can go ahead and directly call that function just like that. But to make our code a little bit cleaner, what we can do is actually insert it directly inside of here just like that. And that might look a little bit odd to you, or you might be confused by this, but now whenever the player clicks the use button, it'll just automatically call the rebirth function just like that. So that'll all work perfectly. So yeah, this UI is pretty simple. All we really have to do is manage the progress bar, which we keep in sync with the player's data whenever their stage changes or they rebirth, and we also update it when the player joins the game as well. In addition to that, we also have to set up the actual use button so that the player can rebirth, which we do right here with the rebirth function. And of course, the rebirth function will communicate to the server from the client, telling the server, hey, I'm the player that wants to rebirth, let me rebirth, and then the server will do whatever the server has to do. So with all that being said, we fully scripted this on the client side. We can go ahead and exit out of this module script, and now we'll go ahead and script this on the server side. So we'll go inside of the server script service, inside of the services folder, and let's go ahead and duplicate the skip service. Of course, we'll go ahead and rename this to be called Rebirth Service, and then we'll open it up. Now inside of here, we're going to need a lot less variables. So we won't actually need the player service or the server script service. We will need the player data service, but not the progress service. We do want the respawn service, and we do want the stages config as well as the remotes variable. Now, inside of the onStart function, we actually don't need to call any function inside of here, but we still do actually need to connect to a remote event. Rather than connecting to the skip remote event, though, we do want to connect to the rebirth remote event. And now let's just remove the function from here for right now because we'll connect it once we create the function. Then we can go ahead and actually remove all of the other functions that we've created inside of here. And now let's go ahead and create our rebirth function. So this is going to be a part of the shared table. table, and it's going to be called Rebirth. And the only parameter that's going to have is the player who wants to rebirth. Now, ultimately, we could add this function to the local table, but the reason that I'm not doing that is because I like to have certain functions on the shared table, just in case in the future, if we add an admin system to our game or different things like that, where we want to be able to easily debug these different things on the server, then we easily can because they're already being shared. So we don't even need to do that, for example. Keep in mind, though, that this is not me saying that we're going to add an admin system to this game, because we're not going to do that. I'm just trying to make it understandable as to why I sometimes add functions to shared, even though we're not actually using them anywhere else except for this one script right here. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and script the logic for when the player wants to rebirth. The first thing that we want to do is go ahead and get the player state. So we're going to go ahead and use the player data service, and then we'll use the get state function passing through the player. Now, if we don't actually get the player state, then we want to go ahead and stop the function right there. Now that we've gotten the player state, we want to calculate or determine if the player can actually rebirth or not. And we've already done this on the client side. So what do? We want to get the player's stage that they're currently on. Then we want to get the total amount of stages, which we'll go ahead and use the stages config for that. So get total stages. Then we'll create a variable called can rebirth. And to determine if the player can rebirth, that means that the stage that they're currently on is greater than or equal to the total amount of stages. Now, if the player cannot rebirth, then what we're going to do is return end and stop the function right there. So now that we're this far down, we know that the player is actually able to rebirth. So let's go ahead and rebirth them. In order to do this, let's go ahead and create a variable for our rebirth action. And normally I name our action variables just action, but we're actually going to be creating two actions here, which is why I'm naming this first one rebirth action. And now actually we want to make sure that we set the type of this. So we're going to say player data service dot update state action equals a table. And now inside of this table, the action that we want to use, or the type, is going to be rebirth. And now we don't even have to include any amount here because, again, by default, the amount is 1. Then we're going to create another action, and this action is going to be for updating the player's stage so that we can set them back to their very first stage. So we're going to call this stage action, which is, again, going to be of the exact same type. So update state action equals, then we'll set it to a blank table. And now the type that we're going to use is update stage. And now we want to pass through an amount to this. And now remember, the way that the update stage action works is it'll basically increase the player's stage by whatever amount that we include inside of here. So if we said 0, then that actually would not change the stage that the player is currently on. Instead, what we need to do is we need to pass through minus or negative total stages, and that will reduce the player's stage down to 0. The thing is, though, is that how our game is set up is we don't have a stage 0, we just have a stage 1. So players all start from stage 1. So because of that, we have to add 1 to negative total stages. And now that will start the player off at stage 1. Now that we've done all of that, let's go ahead and use both of these actions. So we'll go ahead and use the player data service. We'll say update state, we'll pass to the player, and then we'll pass through the rebirth action. And now for updating their state for the second time, we want to go ahead and pass through the stage action just like that. And now the last thing that we need to do inside of here is actually respawn or teleport the player back to the first stage. And we can do that by using the respawn service. So we're going to say respawn service, and we want to use the respawn player function and pass through the player. And now with that being said, we're fully finished with scripting all of the logic for actually rebirthing the player. The last thing that we need to do is connect this function to the rebirth remote event. So we'll go back up inside of our onStart function, and then we'll say shared.rebirth just like that. And now with all that being said, we're pretty much fully finished with implementing this entire system, so we can exit out of this module script. But there's two more things that I want to do just to kind of really fully finish this system. I mean, if you started your game up right now and wanted to test it out, it should work perfectly fine. But one of the last things that I want to do is actually add rebirths to the player's leader stats. So to do that, we want to actually go ahead and update the player data service. Then to add this to the leader stats, the first thing we need to do is actually go inside of the create leader stats function. Now, I actually want to add this before deaths because, I don't know, my brain just kind of feels like deaths should be the last stat that's displayed kind of at the end rather than rebirths. But of course, you can do it any way you want to. Anyway, I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste those 3 lines. Then I'm going to rename this to be called rebirth. I'll go ahead and update both of those variables. Then we want to update the name to say rebirth. And then the actual value, we want to actually go ahead and use rebirth just like that. So now we've added rebirth to the player's leader stats. Another thing that we need to do, though, is actually update the update state function here where we update the leader stats as well. So now I'm going to go ahead and copy this else if statement here. And now if the type of the action is rebirth, then what we're going to do is increase the value of rebirth inside of the leader stats by the amount or 1, just like we did when we updated the state manager. So just in case the amount is not given here, then we'll go ahead and use 1 by default, just like that. And now with that being said, we're actually fully finished with fully implementing this entire system. But again, there's one more thing that I want to do, and that's just to kind of make the testing of this a little bit easier. So inside of the replicated storage, inside of the functions folder, I want to update the update state module. And basically what I want to do is I just want to give the player a ton of skips when they first join the game. And I'm just referring to us. So I actually just want to give us a ton of skips as soon as we join the game right now, just so that we're easily able to actually test the system out. So I'm going to update this right here and just include a big number. And now what I'm going to do is actually go into our game and test this out. So once we enter a game, I actually already am at stage 26, so I'm actually able to already rebirth. If I look at the Rebirth GUI, we can see this is what it looks like. We can see the progress bar is looking all good and everything like that. Let me go ahead and hit the rebirth button, and when I hit the rebirth button, we can see that that all worked perfectly. I was teleported back to the first stage, and my progress bar has been updated as well. We can also see that I've earned 1 rebirth at the top right too, so that's all working good. Now let's go ahead and use a ton of these skips that I actually have, and I'll skip all the way back to the last stage and see once we skip back to the last stage, the Rebirth GUI actually automatically pops up on our screen and it allows me to click the rebirth button once again. And once I rebirth, we're once again teleported back to the very first stage. So that all seems to be working perfectly. Now let's just go to stage 13, for example, open up the rebirth menu. And when I do that, I'm still able to see the progress for when we can rebirth next. We're 13 out of 26. Let's try to rebirth. When I try to rebirth, that's not working at all. So this all seems to be working perfectly. Let's even keep the GUI open, but progress to the next stage. And when I progress to the next stage, we can see that the progress bar is being updated here as well. So again, that all seems to be working perfectly. Now that we know it's all working perfectly, the last thing I want to do is go back to the update state module script and reset this number from a very high one to what we had it on originally, which was just action.amount. And with that being said, I'm going to save that script, and now we're fully finished with implementing the Rebirth system. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, with all that being said, that's going to be it for this episode. As always, if you did enjoy, please smash the like button, and feel free to go down below and leave a comment letting other people know that it worked. I and everybody else really appreciates that. And of course, if you want to gain access to all the scripts, the game file that we made during this episode, and a ton of other resources that you can easily use to make your next Roblox game, there's a link down below in the description to my website, MonzterDev, or my Patreon, which you can support me on both and gain access to all those resources. Anyways, with all that being said, I hope that you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.